The next era of art we'll cover is Ottonian art, and this, like Carolingian art, is associated with the Holy Roman Empire, but there's a bit of a gap. So we have Carolingian art starting in the late 8th century and bringing together things Roman and things Christian and that hierarchy of Northern European life. We're going to see some similar things happening with Ottonian art, and it too will be associated with the Holy Roman Empire, but it is not associated with the Frankish kings. Instead, it's associated with these dukes from Saxony who become German kings and then become Holy Roman emperors. And this basically happens because people liked that stability under the Holy Roman Emperor. They're called Ottonian because these kings have a tendency to name their kids Otto. And here are just a few lists of Germanic kings who had come from Saxony who became Holy Roman emperors. The last of this line is Henry II. He didn't have any sons, and thus no more Saxon kings becoming Holy Roman emperors. Now, I could tell you a bit about the art of the court, which was very showy. You know, they like to display the hierarchy with lots of jewelry and ivory carvings and things like that. But what we really tend to focus on in Ottonian art is the art that is coming out of monasteries. Now, some of this is commissioned by the imperial court, but a lot of it's going to be commissioned by clergy members. The foremost among those clergy who patronized art was Bishop Bernward. He ran the monastery and thus the leading school of Europe at Hildesheim. He was called in to tutor Otto III and then also served as kind of counsel for Otto III. And he visited Rome several times, so he was familiar with the art from ancient Rome that was still visible in Rome. Now, keep in mind that he is a clergyman. And as a clergyman, and also someone who is a leader of a school, he's going to be very interested in concepts, especially theological concepts. That interest in both things Roman and conveying theological concepts is perhaps best seen in two bronze works that Bishop Bernward commissioned. The first of those works is the bronze column of Bishop Bernward, sometimes called Christ's column, and then we'll look at some bronze doors. Now, in both of these works, that bronze is, at this point in time, believed to echo Rome, which had a lot of bronze. There were bronze doors on the Pantheon, there were bronze sculptures, so bronze was a favored material, but also they happened to have a lot of the metals that you needed to make bronze in Saxony, and they were great at mining metals. So that helped a bit. So bronze is going to be something that they use fairly often. We're looking at Bishop Bernward's column, and one of the things that should pop into your mind at this point is, after our coverage of ancient Rome, the triumphal columns that they had in ancient Rome. So we have Bishop Bernward's column over here, we have the Roman column over here. So he's purposely echoing that idea of triumph that he saw on the columns of Marcus Aurelius and Trajan in Rome. This is Trajan's column. But this is not quite the same. First of all, this is not intended for outdoors. This was put in a church. Originally, it had a big cross on the top of it. But also, it is much smaller. To some extent, that is because of the material, bronze, which would be difficult to make something this tall that is structurally sound. but also they just don't quite have all the technology that the Romans had. And I just wanted to give you a little sense of the distinct difference in scale between the Roman monument and Bishop Bernvard's column. What I'm doing here is I'm standing in front of two casts. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London has a fantastic collection of casts of famous artwork. They're all life-size. They try to make them look fairly similar to what the real object is. And they did this because Victoria and Albert was the first museum dedicated to teaching art and teaching the history of art in London. So you'll see that Bishop Bernvard's column is a little more than twice my height. That's over on the right, excuse me, on the left. And on the right, you have the column of Trajan, and it's so big that they can't even fit the entire height of it in the museum. They've chopped it into two parts, the cast, not the real thing, in order to fit it in there in the museum. What's particularly intriguing, though, is that there's a very specific program, and you get this sense that Bishop Bernvard was very aware of delivering information in very specific ways. What's interesting about the column is the selection of scenes and how they're arranged, and it's a really unusual selection of scenes. It begins with the baptism of Christ by John the Baptist, and it has a bunch of scenes, some of which we aren't quite sure what they are, and we're not sure whether they're in chronological order or not, but it does end with Christ's triumphal entrance into Jerusalem. But it's an odd arrangement, and this was put right in the middle of the church, and we get the sense that this was meant to convey some specific knowledge, probably explained during sermons and things like that. And rather than go into all the complex theology that gets related to this column that relates it to things like Lenten penance and stuff like that, I'm just going to read a quote from art historian Valdez, and this is from a Smart History article that she wrote. For a modern viewer, Ottonian art can be a little difficult to understand. The depictions of people and places don't conform to a naturalistic style. And as an aside, this is a deviation from Roman art. They're using Roman references, but they're deviating because they aren't about the naturalism or even the stylization or verism from ancient Rome. And she goes on, and the symbolism is often obscure. As an aside, once again, this is stuff that's coming out of the leading teaching center, the leading scholarly center at the period. There's a lot of complex theology being considered. And to go on. When you look at Ottonian art, keep in mind that the aim for these artists was not to create something that looked realistic, but rather to convey abstract concepts, many of which are deeply philosophical, I personally would say theological, in nature. So I'm not going to go into that with the column because it's so hotly debated, but I will talk about this kind of very specific selection and arrangement of scenes to convey concepts with the next object. And those are the doors of Bishop Bernvard, the bronze doors of Bishop Bernvard. Before I get into the whole kind of theological, obscure concept thing with the doors, let's talk more generally about these. There are clear Roman references here. And this is something that is pretty consistent in Bernvard's choice of works of art to commission. Here, the bronze doors are a reference to Roman bronze doors. And everyone thought bronze doors were very popular in Rome because there were a pair of bronze doors on the Pantheon, an ancient Roman temple that we covered. You should know the Pantheon by now. that Roman temple, which by this time had been converted to a very well-known Catholic church, and it still had its bronze doors on there. So the use of bronze, specifically the use of bronze doors, we have our reference to classicism. Let's talk about how this is typically medieval now. So throughout the class, I've been talking about medieval art as this kind of dialectic that involves animal style and classical. You can think of it as a pendulum swinging back and forth, and sometimes being in the middle, combining the two. Here we have one of those combinations. Over on the left-hand side, we have this fantastic foliage in an interlacing pattern. And even the trees behind the human figures, that forest, supposedly, it's kind of an odd-looking forest, but it's got lots of that looping of that line that goes over and under itself. That relates back to that love of geometric patterning and the interlacing of Northern European animal style. We also have the use of human figures. They're odd human figures, yes, but they are presenting the scene with human figures, which is classical. And even more importantly, they're using bronze, which they see as very Roman. Now, Sarah Bellow, a scholar who wrote a portion of the Heilbrunn timeline of art from the Metropolitan Museum, describes Ottonian style in particular. The reliefs on Bernvard's bronzes are full of figures that are rather unlike anything in Roman art, meaning they aren't stylized in the same way as late Rome, they aren't veristic, and they certainly aren't idealized. Okay? They are attenuated, expressive, and engaged in scenes of wonderful narrative coherence. And I want to focus on that wonderful narrative coherence. These scenes are considered the Bible for the illiterate. That was actually part of canon or Catholic law that was embraced by the monasteries, by people like Bishop Bernvard. So they wanted scenes that clearly told the story. And what they use in the Ottonian era is very simple, straightforward styles to convey the scene. For instance, here, if you look at God the Father, he's over on the left, and you can tell that's God because of hierarchy of scale. That's a really easy way of showing who is most important. Not naturalistic necessarily, but clear. So we have God the Father. And then you know God's mad just by the way he's standing and he's pointing at Adam and Eve. So the other thing that they do so very well in Ottonian art is they use these gestures. Sometimes, gestures that we use, but a little more dramatic. Sometimes they just make the hands bigger. So we have the God pointing at Adam, and then you can see there's Adam. He's just realized he's naked. He's covering up his junk with a fig leaf, and he's trying to indicate Eve over there. And Eve is struggling to cover herself up, but she's like, wait a minute. No, it's not me. It's the serpent. The serpent told me to do it. And you also get sort of like this sense that whoever is worse, who is most sinful, is closer to the ground. They're lower on the picture plane to convey how culpable they are in that first crime or that first sin. So they make the stories very clear, but they're going to do some more interesting things with the program or the arrangement of scenes. So they've selected very carefully scenes. They're going to arrange them carefully. And in that way, they can get to more obscure concepts. Just to show you a few other scenes with these great gestures, here's the fall, or the first sin of Adam and Eve. And you can clearly tell Adam's accepting the apple from Eve. Or the expulsion, there's an angel there saying, "Get out," pointing at them. Once again, they're still covering themselves up, and Adam, Eve has her hand on her cheek like, "Woe is me." So the arrangement of the scenes, I should probably go through and give you a really brief description. If you're really good at biblical history, you can tone out a little bit until you see something pop up on the screen. Okay, so at the top of the left, we have the creation of Eve. And in this case, this shows Eve, who is created from the rib of Adam. Then below that, we have the presentation of Eve, where Eve is presented to Adam. Here is your human companion, Adam. The fall, that refers to the first sin, where Adam and, the serpent tells Eve, "You should have this tree of knowledge fruit," and Eve eats it and gives one to Adam. Underneath that, we have Adam and Eve reproached. That's where God says, "You've done something bad." Then the expulsion, where they're kicked out of the garden. And underneath that are the labors. They are told that Adam will have to toil to produce food, and Eve will have to bear pain in childbirth. Those are the labors. Underneath that, the sacrifices of Cain and Abel, their sons. Cain gives God things produced from the land, and Abel sacrifices an animal. God really likes Abel's better. And that leads to the first murder, where Cain murders Abel. On the other side of the doors at the top, you have the no le matangerie, which is where Christ meets Mary Magdalene, a woman of sin, and says, "Don't touch me. I have been risen. I'm risen from the dead. I am free of all sin and dirtiness. So you can't touch me, dirty lady." And by the way, no le matangerie just means "don't touch me" in Latin. Underneath that, you have the three women at the tomb. These are three followers of Christ who go to his tomb to tend to his dead body. And lo and behold, he's not there because he has risen from the dead. Underneath that is the crucifixion, where Christ dies on the cross. And below that is Christ before Herod. And this is where Christ is condemned to death. Underneath that is a presentation of the temple, where Christ is first recognized as the Messiah when he is brought to the synagogue. Underneath that is the three magi, where the three wise men recognize Christ as this very important being, and they bring gifts to him. Beneath that is the birth of Christ. Hopefully I don't have to explain that. And underneath that is the Annunciation, which is when the angel Gabriel comes to Christ and says, comes to Mary and says, "Hey Mary, have God's baby." And she says, "Okay." So there are the scenes. One of the things I want to point out about this is that this is kind of a weird arrangement. First of all, on one side of this screen, or on one side of the doors, we have scenes from the Old Testament. Okay? So that's before the birth of Christ. On the other side are scenes from the New Testament, the stories of the life of Christ. The scenes on the Old Testament are not very uplifting. They are all about sin. And notice how their arrangement is chronologically from the top to the bottom. They lead down to hell, which is where sinners are supposed to go. Whereas the New Testament starts on the bottom and leads up. Oops, sorry. Those scenes are all about Christ, who redeems our sins, and they lead up to the heavens. So we have like this concept conveyed here in the arrangement of the scenes, but it goes even farther than that, just the up and down, which is pretty straightforward. If you look at the scenes together, one of the things that you start to notice is that the scenes can sort of play off each other in this nice compare and contrast, which you could see being used as a sermon topic. So, for instance, on the bottom of each door, you have the first murder, the pretty major sin down there, and then in contrast, you have the birth of Christ. So you have a death and a birth, or conception. We'll say conception. So you could sort of compare and contrast those over there. Up above that, notice how Eve in the labor's side looks very much like Mary in the three magi scene. So they're kind of comparing these two. Probably the easiest to understand is the fall and the crucifixion. Okay. So the fall is the first sin, and the crucifixion is Christ dying on the cross. If there had been no sin in the Garden of Eden, theologically, none of us would be here. Adam and Eve wouldn't even realize they were naked, and thus probably wouldn't have had kids. But even more importantly, if humanity had not sinned, there would be no need for Christ to be born, become man, and die for our sins. So these scenes are meant to work across the doors as well. And that's the kind of complexity that we expect from people like Bishop Bernvard. Just a few other scenes here. Now, one other point I want to note is that there will be some outside influences on Ottonian art. And one of those is going to happen when Otto II marries a Byzantine princess who brings a whole trousseau of fantastic stuff with her. A lot of it is Byzantine art, and you'll have to sort of recall Byzantine style again. That's going to show up in a number of books produced for Otto II's son, Otto III. And here is a gospel book of Otto III. You can see it's on vellum over here. And when you see a lot of those little dots on the vellum, that is because that is the animal skin, and that's the side with the follicles. So we have this image of Christ who is washing the feet of his apostles. This is right before he is going to die. And we have, again, things that are very Ottonian. We have these very clear gestures. There's Christ with those two fingers sort of pointing at someone means he's blessing someone. And then Peter's like, whoa, I'm not good enough, So that's very Ottonian. You have hierarchy of scale. Christ is the biggest figure. But the other thing I want to point out is there are things that are very Byzantine here. For instance, beyond the gestures, you have those tall, thin figures with the large almond-shaped eyes that are so typical in Byzantine art. The feet are kind of weird. They might not quite hover, but they sort of point down a bit. And you have that gold background that the Byzantine loves being used in this Ottonian work. So it's kind of a combination of that very clear narrative style and the Byzantine love of certain types of figures and the use of gold. We can add in that overly complex theology if we look at the evangelist page for St. Luke in that gospel book of Otto III. So here we have a picture of the human figure, Luke, but see how instead of writing, he's holding his hands up? And up above there, there's a bull or an ox, sometimes he's called the ox, who is writing, and he's writing on a scroll. So, and that ox stands for Luke. In fact, it says his name right above the ox. LVC would be how you write Luke in Latin. And then there's a whole bunch of other people around him with scrolls. These are the Old Testament prophets. And then On either side of the evangelist Luke, down at the bottom, you have these animals that are drinking water from a spring that's rising up underneath Luke. And this is basically a depiction of a saying that theologians had about Luke, which was, "From the source of fathers, the ox brings forth a flow of water for the lambs." So let's translate that into something most of us can understand. Okay, from the source of the fathers is Old Testament prophets. They are the fathers of which they speak. So from up there in the ether, those Old Testament prophets with all their writings. The ox, who is Luke, ox or bull means Luke, brings forth a flow of water for the lambs. So the water would be the gospel, the good news that is going to nourish the faithful. And the lambs are the faithful, the Christians. Christ often referred to his flock, he's the good shepherd and things like that. So here we have these great sort of Byzantine references with those very Byzantine-looking figures. This is a gold background. I know it's kind of weird color in the image, but it's gold, trust me. And then that overly complex, or maybe that extra complex, overly complex is a judgment call, but extra complex theology gets brought into that Ottonian art. There's one more thing I want to add to our discussion of Ottonian art, just to make the next period, Romanesque, clear. So they're building a lot of basilica-style churches in the Ottonian Empire, but I want to talk about where they put the decoration. The decoration was typically a painted wood ceiling. And there are some major problems with having your decoration or your decorative plan be a wood ceiling. It was nice if you were Bernvard and you can get all that bronze, but if you didn't have that kind of money, you would have that decorative wood ceiling with scenes from the Bible and other teaching scenes up there. The problem with that is that wood catches fire pretty easily, especially in buildings that are lit with oil lamps and candles, or buildings that are the tallest buildings around because they want to be seen. These are part of the standardized monasteries, so they have big towers and tall roofs, so that when you get thunderstorms, this is going to be the first thing that's struck. The lightning is going to be attracted to that tallest structure, and a lot of ceilings on churches did catch on fire. So there's a major problem with this kind of decoration plan that the Romanesque churches that have enough money to correct for this problem are going to use. And that's it for Ottonian art.